A false allegation can destroy a man's life even before the evidence is considered. This episode is about false allegations of sexual assault made by women against men, not because female victims don't matter, but because male victims matter as well. When a woman's accusations are treated as proof, the man's reputation becomes the punishment. He can lose his name, he can lose his job, he can lose his future, he can lose his family, and he can lose his sanity, all before the court has ever heard the evidence. False accusations are not just lies, they are reputational violence. And if we are to take justice seriously, then we need to consider the evidence first. So, with that being said, today is a bit of a heavy and controversial episode. Before we go any further, thank you for watching to begin with. And do not forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with as many people as possible. It really helps the channel and boosts the algorithm. Also, let me know what you think about the episode in the comments. I always read your comments and I always appreciate them. So, as I just said there in the opening, false allegations are not just lies. They're reputational violence. And it does seem that particularly post-MeToo movement, that false allegations have been weaponized to an extent that we probably haven't really seen ever in human history. Surely, of course, they've existed, but not to quite the same level. Now, an accusation made by a woman of sexual assault against a man only requires social proof. So what do I mean by that? Well, it only requires the allegation to be made in the first instance as opposed to the legal proof. Even if there is no legal proof, by the time the allegation is circulated in the community, that man is likely to already be experiencing the punishment through his reputation, through his loss of a job if it got to that level, and also mainly any impacts to his family. And when I say family, I'm not talking about men who are actually necessarily in a relationship with another woman and they've committed infidelity or something like that. I'm talking about a man's immediate family, so his mother, his father, his brothers, his sisters, so on and so forth. I think that it's really important to consider that an allegation really travels faster than the correction of that allegation. So once the allegation is made, even slightly, to correct that is going to likely be impossible once it's made. You could end up going to court, you could end up being proven innocent or whatever it might be, but it doesn't matter because it's been a trial by media and your reputation will already be tarnished. There will always be an implication if a woman makes an allegation against you that something did happen, but the law failed, right? So you always hear that. A common thing we always hear in incidents where people, particularly women, are talking about sexual assault conviction rates, they always seem to make the argument that they're under-convicted and that a lot of female victims are left without justice. Well, there may be some data around that, but I would say that there needs to be a legal process, and that if someone is not found to be guilty through the evidence that's been presented and through the person who's made the allegation against them, well, that's the onus of proof is on the person making the allegation. And we shouldn't be restructuring society and the legal system to accommodate someone who has weak evidence just because they believe they were hurt, and they may have been hurt, and it may just be they don't have the evidence, and that's sad. And in those instances, I feel terrible for those men and women who have been victimized. In this case, we're talking about predominantly female sexual assault victims and male perpetrators. But we also shouldn't be putting people on trial under false allegations or destroying their lives, because once it goes to a public trial, for example, if it went beyond a civil matter and it went into the full criminal conviction, which you would expect, right? If it was civil, you'd have to ask questions. Well, this person's effectively trying to sue me for money as opposed to getting a criminal conviction for the wrong. So the the motive there has to be questioned. But once it goes to, say, the magistrates' court, and particularly saying like the Supreme Court or whatever your larger court is in your country, it's likely going to be made public. So at the end of the day, when an accusation is treated as proof, the wrong woman does not actually even need evidence to destroy the man. Okay? Her evidence is that she only needs a convincing story. And something like sexual assault and the victimization of a woman in any crime always carries a major narrative and a story that travels far and wide and makes for great news headlines, particularly with people who are on social media and run their own little miniature media companies and vigilante type behaviors, which are not great. But aside from that, we need to actually challenge the data around this. So even the cautious data still matters. And what do I mean by that? Well, even the lower numbers that are stated to be false allegations still matter. So what I would say is if we consider some studies, so I'll just look at a few here. So there was a study, a meta-analysis of police classifications data that confirmed that about 5.2% of sexual assault allegations that were made were confirmed to be false. 5.2%. Okay. Similarly, in another United States study, 5.9% of false allegations collected from a sample of 136 university students were also found to be false allegations. All right. Now, on top of that, a third study was done, again, in the United States, where at the upper end, 7.1% of people that had made a claim of sexual assault, women in this instance against men, self-admitted that the claims were false. Now, before I hear you all go, wow, but yes, that's the point. It's such a small number of women making false allegations. That leaves on the table, 95 to 97% or whatever it might be of the rest of these allegations being true and convictable. Well, maybe you're right. Maybe that is the case. Maybe on that data, the allegations of sexual assault made by women against men are largely true. And if we're being fair, most of them probably are, at least the majority. But it's important to define what the majority is and what that exactly means, because often it's said, but then the implication is taken further, particularly by people on the left wing, people as in feminist organisations with an ideology and agenda to push, to make such a claim and then infer from that therefore any man who is alleged to have engaged in sexual assault of a woman is highly, highly likely guilty, right? We need to be careful making that large jump effectively. But if we were to summarize that data, really, even the cautious studies really set the floor of false allegations at about 5 to about 7%. Now, obviously this is important not to just dismiss this. It's a valid issue, and it's a valid concern in two ways. One, well, it overwhelmingly seems that the sexual assault allegations are truthful. And two, there is still a portion there of men who may be getting false sexual assault allegations leveled against them. Now, in the grand scheme of sheer population size and numbers, you may argue, well, it's only a small amount of men. Okay, but you're still destroying a man's life, and the second and subsequent order effects of destroying that man's life are likely going to be destroying his family's lives and his other loved ones' lives as well. So it's important to consider that. Now, interestingly enough, there are far higher estimates in other studies that were conducted regarding false allegations of sexual assault. And it's important that these studies at the upper end are not erased and dismissed simply because we have the aforementioned data. Now, as I said, the low end figures there, that 5 to 7% range that are proven to be false sexual assault allegations, sets a floor. But there are studies, again, from the United States where they found that approximately 32% of women admitted false reports in a police replication study. So replication study was obviously replicating those prior studies that I talked about where they found those lower numbers. In another study, at a higher level, 41% of false rape allegations within a small police agency study in a smaller neighborhood or area, if you will, in the United States were also found to be false rape allegations or false sexual assault allegations, if you will. Now, obviously, there's a stark contrast, between 5 to 7% and 32 and 41% at the upper end. But let's assume 5 to 7% is the absolute floor, and then in there, let's remember this 32 to 41% data, because although it's important that those numbers are mentioned not to be necessarily national prevalence rate, but it's also important to add that they're not irrelevant either. Studies are important, and every study has a limitation. It doesn't mean you throw the study out just because it has limitations. People will argue, well, the limitation was this or the limitation was that. Any good research must have a limitations section admitting what they could have done better or what the flaws were so that future studies can potentially fill those gaps. That's what all good studies do. So be aware when someone goes, but even they said the limitations were X, Y, Z. Yeah, that's common. Are we going to dismiss all research and studies because they mention limitations? Or are we going to say, well, that's really honest of them to say that, and it allows us to make further, better research based off that? I think that's important. So, if we consider that number again, let's remember 32 to 41% at the upper end. It's important to understand that the careful position to take, I guess, is that not that false allegations are everywhere, but that the careful position, I should say, is that there are official confirmations that the rates may significantly change from anywhere from that 5% up to that 41%, depending on where the sample is taken from, okay? But this is where it gets quite concerning, right? Women's self-report data about false sexual assault allegations raises serious concerns, okay? I want to put emphasis on that. It raises serious concerns. Once again, this is important to consider in the grand scheme of the data I've already mentioned. What we are seeing is that what a woman admits privately, right, should be a concern to us publicly. Okay? And what do I mean by that? Well, in terms of the self-report data out of the USA, and they've got 3 studies here, as we've already touched on, some studies indicate about 7.1% of women made false sexual assault allegations against men. However, around 31% of women reported knowing another woman who had made false sexual assault allegations against a man. And if that wasn't bad enough, 39.6% of women indicated that they could imagine, if needs be, making a false sexual assault allegation against a man if it were to benefit them. That's disturbing. And this is exactly the kind of data that men in my realm, the men's rights activists of the world, and just men in generally who have experienced false accusations, have warned about for decades. Okay? So, revisiting it, we said that the flaw of false allegations that are proven against women making these accusations against men is about 5 to 7%. We can agree on that. I think that's a pretty reasonable claim. However, when we actually ask women directly and get them to self-report privately, as I just said, the numbers seem to start to indicate that maybe those higher percentages of false allegations that we mentioned, that 32% to 41% in the smaller samples, might actually be more accurate of the general population than we would like to admit, because women are self-reporting, in this instance, 31%, to knowing other women who have made sexual assault allegations against men that were not true. And then, again, on top of that, that the 39.6% of women admitted that they could imagine themselves making a false allegation against a man if the circumstances called for it. So those numbers actually line up pretty well. Yes, they're different metrics. One might be from the larger studies, one might be from small police studies, and one might be self-reported studies. But there's a bit of a similarity there, and I think it's important not to completely throw the baby out with the bathwater in this, because the main headline around this should be that effectively, if a woman is willing to make and report false accusations, then that brings into question all of the other data, because it may indicate there is an underreporting of false allegations being made of sexual assault by women against men, and not the opposite, which is so often talked about in our society, that the allegations that are made are disproportionately ignored and not dealt with in the correct way in the criminal justice system. It may actually just be the case that most of them that do slip through are quite clearly unjustifiable and false accusations. Okay? That's really important to consider. But with that being said, I think that it's important to obviously say that we can protect women and we can protect female victims of sexual assault perpetrated by males without destroying the entire male population and demonizing them because of long-standing beliefs that are embedded deeply with feminist ideology and, let's face it, rampant misandry. Not just feminist ideology, not just first and second wave feminism, but the third, fourth, fifth waves of feminism, which move from a humanistic perspective of caring about men and boys but wanting equality with them, competing on the same level, to demonizing them and pointing the finger at them for all the social pathologies of the world that we live in today. At the end of the day, sexual assault is real. It is serious. It is destructive. And the other side of that coin is that also false accusations are real as well. And if anything, it's the false accusations that are being underreported, not the actual true cases of sexual assault committed by men against women that are getting underreported. That's a key thing to remember. It's not the false allegations that are the problem here so much. It's the fact that there are women out there who are willing to admit that they would weaponize false allegations if the needs be. A third of them, or up to a third of them. Right there, two problems in and of itself that need to be considered. So I think it's important to sort of discuss, like, well, what does this mean? What does this mean for men? Well, it means that, unfortunately, as we've known for a long time, that the criminal justice system is heavily weighted against you. And society is heavily weighted against you. And both of those things are certainly heavily weighted against you when the crime that is under the lens is sexual assault against a woman perpetrated by a man. Okay? If you are falsely accused, which we now understand from having read this data, there is a significant chance that that could still happen, despite what we are led to believe about false allegations being vanishingly rare, and despite that flaw we talked about. Well, it means that in those instances that men need to be really cautious about how they proceed with dating and courtship more generally. Okay? My advice here, the big one, is that if you are a single man and you are wanting to meet women and you are wanting to date women and you're wanting to have sex with women and you're wanting to have a relationship with a woman, right? The latter of all those being the end lovely goal, right? And maybe marriage and having children, then you need to, as I've said in my previous episodes, you need to understand that it is most important to date a woman and judge a woman on her character before you bond with her. Not her looks, her character. Because at the end of the day, if she's an unstable woman, she has any history of making false allegations or making men's lives a misery, or she has something like a borderline personality disorder or any other mental health issue that she hasn't bothered to treat, then she's a walking liability and you are potentially going to throw your life away, okay? Because if you set foot wrong dating or you are sleeping with that woman, it only takes one accusation to ruin your life. So, like I've said in my other videos, you've got to stop thinking with your dick, start thinking with your brain. The heart is going to often override all of those things, but that can come a bit later once you've actually bonded with a woman who's got character. Then it's more complex, and there are maybe some exceptions to the rule and complexities around issues with the relationships breaking up. And as I said in my videos about betrayal and needing to know when to let her leave. Okay, that's a really important video. If you're at that stage where things have got rough, I would highly encourage you to watch that video, Let Her Leave, and that would talk to you a little bit about how to remove yourself from a relationship in a way where you can walk away with your head held high and move forward with strength. Okay, so anyway, look, that's quite a bit there to sort of go through, but I think that I just want to reiterate that when a woman's sexual assault allegations in and of themselves are treated as proof, then the man's reputation will become the evidence. Okay? So, at the end of the day, this is the kind of behavior that is, it's character assassination, it's reputational violence, and there's all the more reason for us as men to be more careful with how we approach women and how we date women, and particularly how we choose to be sexually intimate with women. And on that note, really importantly, I highly, highly recommend that you are not sleeping with women for the first time with alcohol involved at all, and preferably not at night time, which is obviously when you're going to do most of this stuff, right? Unless you got the weekend and you got the whole day, okay? In my personal experience, of all the women I've been intimate with, I would say literally 95% no alcohol was ever involved, and the small percentage of alcohol was involved. They really had to twist my arm to go out and meet them for a drink. And even in those situations, I don't think I drank because I wasn't a drinker, right? So when alcohol's involved, that line around consent can be blurred, and all it takes is the inference of a woman saying, for example, oh, I had a bit much to drink, I wasn't really thinking clearly, right? Or, I don't know, he just seemed a bit pushy. Or, we slept together and I left as soon as possible next morning because I really regretted it. I really shouldn't have done that. Those words, the implicit premises in that, can be extrapolated out to potentially a false allegation. So if you sleep with a woman and you hear her using that kind of language after she's slept with you, I felt you're a bit pushy, or I felt a bit uncomfortable, or I felt that maybe I had a bit much to drink. If you're in that situation, you're already in a very high risk situation. You want to tread very carefully. If you've done the wrong thing and you've taken advantage of her, well, hopefully the law comes down on you hard, right? But it is very easy for those allegations and those types of words to be thrown around, even subtly, because as opposed to making a blatant public statement, he sexually assaulted me, right, which carries with it other legal consequences around defamation and that kind of thing. All they have to do is imply it. They can pop on something like I've featured on in the past, like, "Sis, is this your man, Tasmania?" Right? Shout out to all of you, by the way. And they can make a false allegation or a reputational remark about someone just short of a defamation threshold, but enough that enough women get involved, it paints a larger picture without the words having to be at a level where it crosses a defamation threshold, okay? So language is important, words are important, context is important. Avoid alcohol like the plague when you're going to be sexually intimate with a woman that you've only just met, or even you've been dating early, okay? So anyway, that's sort of all I've got to say. I'd like to talk about this a bit more, obviously, in other videos. But it is really important to just remember that that floor is about 5 to 7% where false accusations of sexual assault perpetrated by men against women are proven to be false. And at the upper end, it seems that there are numbers as high as 41% indicating that the false allegations of sexual assault against women perpetrated by men may exist. And those high numbers actually align with self-reported data where women are saying, up to 31% of them, that they know other women who have made false sexual assault allegations against men. And then 39% of women are saying that they would be willing to make a false sexual assault allegation against the man if the circumstances call for it. Those final numbers, I think, if anything, are the most disturbing and worrying, and we need to be aware of those, and more research needs to be done on those as soon as possible. But in my experience and understanding academic censorship and the gynocentric world that we live in now, that's heavily feminist ideology laced, it's unlikely that that's really going to happen. And if it does, they're not going to be probably published in prominent journals or be able to be published at all. And then by virtue of that, when anyone finds out about them, people on the hardcore left and hardcore feminists can say, oh, it's a fringe study, doesn't mean anything because it wasn't peer reviewed or it wasn't in a large journal. It's all part of a plan to effectively castrate and demonize men and boys. And that's very troubling. It's very sad because there are men out there who are absolutely the victims of false allegations of sexual assault made by women against them, and they have their lives and their families' lives absolutely destroyed. So my heart goes out to those men who have had those false allegations. I truly believe that any woman who makes a false allegation against a man should receive double the sentence that he would have received had he actually committed that crime and gone to jail for it. But anyway, as I've said, and I've said that about 3 or 4 times, trying to sign off, we'll talk about this a little bit more. But as always, thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great day.